Hey, this is Coach Arch here. I'm here to talk to you about the next test. That's chapter 4. Most of the sections 2, 3, and 4 talks a lot about colonialism and the effect on colonialism in the world economy and societies in general in the world. First thing I want to talk about is your graphic organizer. Everybody should have a graphic organizer. We all worked on that in class and studied that quite a bit. Keep in mind some of the general characteristics. The Spanish, the general characteristics, they did not bring their families over very much. They were looking for gold, glory, and God. They brought, as another pattern of colonization, they brought gold and silver back to Spain. In Portugal, the Portuguese set up Brazil. It didn't take long for them to figure out that the best way to make money in Brazil was in the sugar trade. So they had to get cheap labor. Slaves were the cheap labor, and the slaves came from Africa. So Portugal, their pattern of colonization was bringing slaves over, making money in the sugar industry. Next, we'll talk briefly about France. France started off in the area that's now Canada, all the way down the Mississippi River into New Orleans. And they started off in the fur trade. Their pattern of colonization was to make money in the fur trade. French men did not bring their families, so they had wives amongst the Native American people. That was part of the pattern of colonization. Those from the Netherlands, the people that we call the Dutch, they came over and settled in the area of New York. That is the Hudson River, from Albany all the way down to New York. Those people also were involved in the fur trade. Part of their pattern of colonization was to accept other people from different parts of Europe. The English had a settlement in Jamestown. Jamestown was also the first permanent English city in what's now the United States. Jamestown, eventually they figured out to make money they had to have tobacco. So they grew tobacco, and that's how they made money. The people in Jamestown, the men, that is, ended up bringing women over from England. They brought their families and eventually set up communities. So that's part of the pattern of colonization there in Jamestown. Another English area that we'll talk about is with Plymouth Colony in basically Massachusetts. The English settlements there were involved in setting up communities, bringing over families, and that was their pattern of colonization. Okay. The other pattern of colonization, the reason for settling in Massachusetts by the English was for religious purposes. Just nod when you're ready. All right, a couple of firsts. The first permanent English settlement in what is now the United States is Jamestown. The first European settlement in what's now the United States, St. Augustine. The first European settlement in the New World is Santo Domingo. All right, let's talk about slavery briefly. Slavery started in a certain way in North Africa in the 7th century because of the Islamic people, the Muslims, the Islamic people started a new type of slavery. That slavery changed around 1500 when the Portuguese came in. One of the things we want to talk about slavery is the first part of slavery was Africans enslaving Africans and selling them to Europeans. This obviously was very inexpensive labor for the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Portuguese and the Spanish were the ones that started the slave trade as far as the Europeans are concerned. The English came a little bit later. Slaves were brought across the Atlantic Ocean in what we call the Middle Passage. Most of the slaves in what's now the United States came from the Caribbean islands of the West Indies. Okay, next I want to talk briefly about the French and Indian War. French and Indian War happened 1754 to 1763. It was between the French and their friends, the Native Americans, around the area that we know as Canada today, and they fought against the English settlers. For the most part, there were a few Indian tribes with the English settlers, but for the most part, it was the French and the Indians against the English settlers. The result of that was that France had no more land in North America, and the English got a lot of land, basically a new area for the English. Well, the English took almost all the land to the east of the Mississippi River, and everything west of the Mississippi River was actually part of Spain. England also got St. Augustine, Florida at that time. Okay. There was also a new economic model that came with all of this colonization and exploring. A brand new way of global trade. Part of it was with what we call the triangle trade, and in the triangle trade, in the classic model, there are manufactured goods that start in Europe that are taken down to Africa, and from Africa slaves go to the New World in what we call the Middle Passage, and then from the New World back to Europe are certain raw materials that Europeans used to make finished products. Another typical triangle trade was, of course, the slaves coming from Africa to the Americas, in the West Indies, the Caribbean, and then from there, sugar and molasses going to New England, that is the area that we now know as Massachusetts, and that whole area of New England. And from there, rum going from there down to Africa. So a couple different triangle trades. A few points we need to make about all this. These were new systems. There was a few new terms that we need to talk about with this. These colonies were started by joint stock companies. Joint stock companies are just like corporations today. You can buy stock in them. Back then, people bought stock in them to spread out risk, and that's how many colonies were started back then. Another word that we talk about, another word we use is capitalism. Capitalism involves private ownership of property and private ownership of business. This is different because before this time, kings and queens owned all the businesses and owned all the property, and it was during this time that people could start businesses. Another word we use is mercantilism. Mercantilism is all about having a favorable balance of trade. Under mercantilism, you as a country or as a king has to sell more than you buy, make more money in exports. Okay, don't import so much. You need to keep that money in reserves, that is gold in the basement, for future wars. So mercantilism is part of this new kind of commercial revolution and this new global trade. The reasons that European countries set up colonies was to make money. So they had to make money through the idea of mercantilism. Okay, we have also talked about the Columbian Exchange. Now, one of the things I want to make very clear is the Columbian Exchange is not an economic model. No one exchanged wheat for corn in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Columbian Exchange simply are products or diseases or different things that before Columbus discovered America were only New World, and after might have transferred over to the Old World, and vice versa. So we talked about a lot of different products this whole week that were New World products and Old World products. But the key there is it affected society, especially in Europe, because it created a very large population boom. Potatoes were brought to Ireland and their population exploded. Italians found out they loved tomatoes. They could add that to pasta and have a great sauce. Different things like that. Diseases completely wiped out Native American people. 90% of the Native Americans that were in the New World were dead probably within 100 years. So diseases were a big factor in wiping out Native peoples. Africans were forcibly migrated in this whole new commercial revolution and the way that trade changed throughout the world. You ready? All right, a couple notes here just to throw in at the end. Pirates were real, and they operated mostly in the Caribbean at this time. Pirates and privateers was part of the problem between England and Spain. Total number of Africans that were forcibly migrated through the Middle Passage was about 10 million. Missions. We talked before about the Spanish. They were very much involved in missions. In fact, there were a line of missions from St. Augustine, Florida, all the way past Tallahassee, and it actually affected the area of southeast Alabama. Okay, so that's your review for the test. Study hard.